Good morning and Shabbat Shalom and welcome. This is Valley Beth Shalom live online Torah study for a Shabbos morning. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein in Southern California. This is my dear friend and teacher, Rabbi Marc Gellman in South Florida. And it's our pleasure to join you this morning for a little bit of Torah study as we begin this celebration of Shabbat. So before we get into the Kriya this morning, the Torah this morning, which is so very important, it's Parashat Yitro. I'd like to just take a moment and reflect. This has been an extraordinary week. Of course, a week ago, Shabbos, we sat holding our breaths, watching this hostage situation, as it were, in Colleyville, Texas. This man who comes into the synagogue finds a rabbi and 3 worshipers, 4 people in shul, and holds them for some 11 hours until the rabbi engineers an escape and the FBI takes him down. And it shook us. I think it shook many of us, wondering whether this would be yet another Pittsburgh, another situation where Jews would die for the right of coming to shul on a Shabbos to pray together. And thankfully, thanks to the FBI, thanks to the police, thanks to the circumstances, to the quick and calm thinking of the rabbi, and thanks to God, of course, it didn't happen that way. But it shook us that way. I mean, for a rabbi like me who prays every morning in shul and every morning every Shabbos with a congregation in front of me. I mean, one of the things I wondered, and Marc, I'm sure you wondered as well, what if there had been 200 or 300 people in that room instead of just 4? And what if the guy had come in with explosives instead of just a weapon? And what if he had been more devious, more insidious than he actually was? And how terrible this Shabbos, this next week would have been. In the course of the week, I got all kinds of calls from the members of the press. And the questions were interesting. The first question was, of course, is your synagogue committee adding to their security? And of course, I said, yes. We already have a very robust security system. We've had it for many, many years. There was a shooting, a tragic shooting here in this valley 25 years ago in the North Valley Jewish Community Center. And since then, we've had very, very robust security. The second question has to do with, are you taking extra training? And I said, I suppose we will, because it was actually a good idea to do that, and they've arranged for that. Has law enforcement been in touch with you? And gratefully, yes, the LAPD was in touch right away. In fact, during the whole crisis, we were in touch with the LAPD commanders, with the FBI through the ADL, our connection with the FBI, the Jewish Federation's Community Security Initiative, and we're very grateful for that. But the very best question was a gentleman who called me from NBC News, and he said, you have an ethic of welcoming. He says, I see that from your website. I say, yeah, it's very important to us. Well, how do you square an ethic of welcoming with the care you have to take to protect the campus from invaders? And I thought about it, and I simply said to him with a broken heart,
That's beautiful.
It's the only thing I can think of, Marc. I am responsible on a weekday for hundreds and hundreds of kids who study on our campus, of dozens and dozens and dozens of people, many seniors, young families who come to the synagogue for learning, for growth, for counsel, for strength, for inspiration. I have to protect them. That's my responsibility as the senior leader of the congregation. At the same time, we have an ancient ethic of welcoming. Abraham welcomes people to his tent, and there's no guards standing there. So what do? We make compromises. We try the best we can, and this is what the world demands of us. I'm very proud, for example, that as I come in the morning, we have guards every morning, and the guards know the names of all the little kids who come in. They know their families' names. They used to give high five, now they give fist bumps. And they talk about what you learned in school today. They're gracious welcomers and greeters. And yet, this is a young man who is thankfully heavily trained and heavily armed. He's wearing a Kevlar vest. He's wearing a very lethal weapon on his hip and a stun gun on his chest protector. He has multiple radios to contact for reinforcements. And his job is to put his person between us and the danger out there. And the terrible thing, Marc, and you'll appreciate this, it's become normal.
Yeah.
Damn it. It's become normal. It's become part of the landscape of the synagogue. You can go to the supermarket, no one hassles you at the gate. You can go to a movie theater, you can go to a mall. I mean, in Israel, they check you, but not here. But if you can go to a church, But if you come to shul, you're going to have to pass by my guys who are going to look you over a little suspiciously and check your purse and check your bag and ask you have an appointment and do you have ID? Not because we want to shoo you away, but because that's the craziness of the world. And because that's become the new normal,
Yes.
it breaks my heart. It just breaks my heart. I pray that someday our kids will be able to not see that, to come into shul. But until then, that's what Colleyville reminds us of. It opened our eyes to how slowly these things have built up. You know, how slowly we've added the fencing and the cameras and the lights and the guards and the ID checking and the metal detectors. And now it's part of what we do. And
I
that is
know.
and that is the tragedy. If that's really the tragedy of Colleyville, it made us aware of that once again. And I have to say that as a leader of a congregation that truly belongs, that truly welcomes those and tells everyone that they belong, that really hurts. It really does hurt.
That's
Anyway,
beautifully
good.
said. Yes.
Thank
You
you.
know, I think of the difference between uh, that natural and proper response to danger and the incredible response of the Mother Emanuel Church in Charlottesville, who was the victim of extreme openness. The guy came to the Bible class, they welcomed him, he
Right.
sat with the Bible class, and then he killed them all. And they didn't change a thing.
Yeah.
They didn't change a thing. And I say worse, better, depends on your point of view about absolute forgiveness. They forgave Dylan Roof, this horrible man. I shouldn't even have said his name. Yamach Shemo, may his name be eradicated. But they even forgave him. So even in this tension, and I think there are people, now they're Christians and they aren't normally the subject of an attack like Jews are. And I understand that there's a big difference there, but they are clinging to a level of openness that is uncompromisable. They're saying, even if you come to kill us, we will still greet you with open arms. That's a very challenging alternative.
Yeah. I can't, as a Jew, I can't live with that.
No, I can't either.
I can't, because I have every instinct in me, especially since the 20th century, tells me that I welcome you to pray, to learn, to grow, to ask questions. I've always told my students and people of all faith, there is no question you can ask me which will get me angry. We will talk openly about faith, about God, about religion. If you disagree with me, that's just fine. That's an old Jewish tradition. But if you come to hurt my children, I am going to stand between you and them and impose any amount of force I need to, because that's what it means to be a Jew in the 21st century. That's what we learned from the 20th century.
I agree.
Yitz Greenberg's beautiful teaching that powerlessness invites abuse, and a vision of powerlessness invites abuse, and that we have a mitzvah to remain powerful enough to protect ourselves, not to be forbidding, not to let it corrupt us and make us cruel or brutal. God forbid. But
there's I agree with you, period. I agree with you. However, there is another view of these things.
I understand it. And ethically, it's magnificent.
And not just Charlottesville. There's a book on this powerless issue, The Wineskin and the Wizard by Michael Seltzer, a friend of mine. And he makes the case as a political scientist that it was powerlessness that enabled us to survive 2,000 years
yes.
of oppression in the diaspora, that because we were powerless, there was no advantage in conquering us, killing us, pursuing us. But then you have to say, well, what about the Holocaust? We were powerless there, and they killed 1 out of every 3 Jews in the world in a 4-year period. So this is one of the great challenges. To what degree do we close our hands in a fist, and to what degree do we open them in welcome? And it's a very, very challenging and difficult issue.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the question of how do you deal with power. That what Theodore Herzl told us. Unfortunately, it took us 50 more years to
Yeah.
realize it, is that you can't live as a powerless people in this century. You could do it for 1800 years, and it did save us. It was exactly right. It was the strategy of Yochanan ben Zakkai when he gave up Jerusalem to the Romans and to give me Yavne.
Give me.
And it worked up
It
until the
worked.
19th century. And
Then
then at
it
the
didn't work.
end of the 19th century, Herzl said, okay, game over. Now we got to go back to power. Right. But it doesn't mean we have to worship power. We just have to have enough of it.
Right.
So let's turn to the Torah this morning. It is a remarkable Torah portion. As you know, it is really the fulcrum of this book of Exodus. Remember, it's in the book of Exodus in Hebrew is called Shemot. And Shemot means names. And this is a book of identity. And the first 4 Torah portions tell us the story of the principal narrative of how we became the people we are, our slavery in Egypt, and the marvelous process, the miraculous process of liberation, which ended last week with the splitting of the Red Sea and our crossing. Now we come into the desert, and the second experience after Egypt and the Red Sea, the second great experience, which turns us into a people and gives us a vision of what's demanded of us, is the moment at Mount Sinai. And traditionally, the moment at Mount Sinai is understood to be a moment when God comes into our world and meets the Jewish people. We come to the bottom of the mountain, and the Torah says, in a very convoluted narrative, it's a difficult narrative to read, God comes down the mountain and speaks to Moses, and Moses speaks to us, and we receive the 10 commandments, the beginning of a series of commandments, of moral and ethical and religious imperatives which shape us as a people and shape our vision of what we are. Now, before we get into the content of this, which is so interesting, there's one interesting fact of it that Rabbi Gellman has taught on. The name of this revelation in Hebrew is not 10 commandments. The word is Aseret HaDibrot. Dibrot from the word midaber, meaning speech, sayings, 10 sayings. So Marc, what's the difference between 10 commandments and 10 speakings, 10 sayings?
Right. Well, that difference would only be noticed by a darshan, by a Midrash writer who believes that every word is a clue and every word has a purpose. And so when I began to take Midrash, modern Midrash, seriously, and I reread the Torah just on that basis, what have I missed? I did, to prepare writing Midrash, I just read it as if it was new to me. I read the JPS text without Hebrew and without commentary, just as if it was a book. And I said, what am I missing that I have not seen all these years? And this just popped out to me right away. Wait a minute, why isn't it the Aseret HaMitzvot? Why is it so? The thing is, a davar, it's a clue. And I think I have the answer. Although you don't debate about Midrash, here's my answer. A davar can be a word, it can be a thing, an event. Vayehi achar ha'devarim ha'eleh. And it came to pass after these things, these events. So I took them as 10 events. And so my Midrash is that the Torah doesn't have the 10 commandments in Exodus 20. It starts again in Exodus 20. And each of the commandments is a reworking of an event in the Torah that preceded the 10 commandments. So my theory in the Midrash is the Torah begins again at Sinai. It isn't an event, it begins again. It's another creation. And so here it is. Number 1, I'm the Lord your God. That's the event of God before creation. And it teaches us that we need to love God before the law. Before anything God tells us to do, our principal thing is to love God alone. Not for what God gives us, not for what God creates for us, but just God. Just the fact that the universe has God as the creator. That's number 1. Number 2 is the creation week. Don't worship anything that is created, only worship the creator. The third is the words, don't take the name of the Lord God in vain. And so that's to recognize that only God can create by words. Yehior, let there be light, by Yehior, and there was light.
I would actually, can I just jump in for a second? Again, not to argue Midrash, but I think it's even, I love the idea. It's a beautiful drasha.
Wait, let me finish.
But let me just add one thing. It's not that only God can create with words. It's the opposite. God gave us that power too. Be
Yes,
careful using it. You can create a world with words,
exactly.
and you can destroy a world with words.
Yes,
And be
yes,
damn careful how you, excuse me, be very careful how you use your words. That's what that
exactly right.
says.
And also that words are not magic, that you can't use words to compel or coerce God in prayer, that words can't be used that way. So it's about words. The fourth davar is Shabbat, and that's the end of creation. The fifth davar is honor your father and your mother, and that's Adam and Eve, who are the father and mother of all people. The sixth is don't steal. Don't kill. And that is Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel, and that's the story transformed into a davar, into a mitzvah. 7 is don't commit adultery, which is what happens when Abraham says to Pharaoh that Sarah, his beautiful wife, is his sister, and he takes her into his harem. That's adultery. And then 8, do not steal. That, of course, is Jacob's theft of the birthright from Esau. 9 is do not bear false witness. It's not tell the truth. That's an interesting side issue for another day. There is no commandment to tell the truth. And we've talked about that in the past. But this is about the false story that Joseph's brothers tell when they sell him into slavery, that a wild beast tore him up. And 10, don't covet. That's about manna. God says, I'm going to give you enough manna to eat. Don't covet it, and don't try and hoard it. Don't buy too much toilet paper and paper towels in the pandemic. Don't covet anything more than what you need. And that story of the manna immediately precedes Sinai. And so what you've done in the 10 Commandments, you've transformed the entire history of the Jewish people into commandments. And that's my Midrash.
That's lovely. That's a wonderful Midrash.
The Torah doesn't begin at Sinai. It begins again.
I love it. That's a beautiful Midrash. I really appreciate that Midrash.
Thank you. So that's my deal on that.
I would go, let me give you mine, and then we'll move on because there's a big question that we have to answer. So there's so many interesting takes on this, and I've been working with bar mitzvah kids all week, and they've been writing all the speeches about this. The one that really moves me is something that my teacher Harold Schulweis taught us once. He said, look, he did toward the end of his life, Harold opens his heart to Hasidus, to Hasidut. At the beginning of his life, of course, he was Mordechai Kaplan's student, who was thoroughly rational, and like Kaplan, he thought Hasidism was just a bunch of superstitious, mystical claptrap. But slowly, he got into Heschel, and he started reading Hasidut, and he started with teaching us, especially the Kotzker Rebbe, who was this amazing, interesting, much like Kierkegaard, according to Heschel, philosopher, rabbi. And he said, here's the difference between a Chassid and every other kind of Jew. Every other kind of Jew is taught, not in the commandments, but taught you shouldn't lie. But a Chassid says you shouldn't lie to yourself. The Kotzker Rebbe was the great master of this idea of truth, telling the truth to yourself. Heschel wrote a beautiful book, a beautiful 2 volumes that was translated into one book called A Passion for Truth about the Kotzker Rebbe. You shouldn't lie to yourself. And Schulweis was so taken with that he said one day in Shul, he made it very interesting, he said, take the 10 commandments and apply that reflexive to each one of them. So the Torah says, you shall not murder, you shall not kill. But the Chassid would say, you shall not kill yourself. So now think of all the ways we kill ourselves. I mean, think of not the big ways, God forbid, but even the small ways in which we make choices that are self-destructive, choices that are against the values that we hold so dear. You will not commit adultery. You will not commit adultery against yourself. You will not prostitute yourself. You will not compromise your integrity. You will not steal. This is a good one. You will not steal from yourself. Think about the ways we steal from ourselves. We take time away from the people that matter. We take energy away from the things. And he went through all of them. I am the Lord your God, no other gods before me. Of yourself, you'll not make of yourself a god. And I think it's such for those of you who are watching at home, you take the 10 Commandments this Shabbos and go through each one of them and ask yourself, what would happen if I turn it reflexive, right? Honor the father and mother in yourself, right? Honor the Shabbat that is of you. It becomes a wonderful drasha.
That's beautiful.
A nice drasha?
I love your Midrash. I do. I taught creative writing at Northwestern is one of the things I taught there. And I would I actually taught a Midrash class at Northwestern. And one of the assignments was for the writers in my class to write an answer to this question. What one change would you make in the 10 Commandments?
Right. That's a beautiful question to ask.
Right. And it could
add one, yeah.
Question. And the most interesting answers was, I think, my answer. I like mine the best.
That's why we teach these classes, so we can discover things, right?
That's what I think.
Yeah.
And I'll offer it, and then I want to know what you would think. Yeah. Mine was lo tachmod, because obviously it's the only commandment, not mitzvah. It's the only commandment which is against an attitude of the mind, not an action. The rabbis knew that this was a contradiction, so they transformed it in their commentaries. Well, what it means is don't take an action based on coveting. But the text doesn't support that interpretation. The text says, don't have even, like Jimmy Carter, I lusted in my heart. Don't have any mental attitude. There's no commandment against lusting in your heart. It's actual lusting, there's a commandment. So I would change that one. And then I might do a change of eliminating all of them except don't steal. Because everything is about stealing. Stealing a life, stealing knowledge, But anyway, those are my answers. What are yours?
This interesting. You talk about eliminating. So there's you can go look this online. George Carlin, the great comedian.
Yeah, I heard.
No friend of religion, but he does a shtick where he takes the 10 and he says, look, they can all be taken down to this. He starts with 10, he gets them down to 5, he takes 5, he gets them down to 3, he gets down to 1, which is basically be good, be kind. It's a wonderful drasha. I mean, if you forget about all of his other shtick and his language, it's a wonderful drasha. I would do this. I've done this with kids, which was very productive. I said to them, take the last 5 and turn them from negative to positive. So thou shalt not murder. So what's the positive version of that?
Thou shalt give life.
Revere and protect life. Right. Give life. Give life. You shall not commit adultery, which is bond faithfully and truthfully, right? You will not steal, which means you will give. I mean, and if you do it that way, I understand why the Torah does it that way, because they're sort of they're boundary lines. This is the moral floor. If you turn them into positive commandments, you get a glimpse of the moral roof, the moral ceiling, to give life, to share, to partner faithfully, to give of your possessions. This becomes the moral ceiling that we aspire to. And we live as between the two, between the moral floor and the moral ceiling, aspiring to one, but observing the other.
What one change would you make?
That's the change I would make. I'd make them positive instead of negative.
All positive.
I'd make them all positive. That's what I would like. But that's because I have more chutzpah than you.
But I am the Lord your God.
Now those are already positive though. Revere your parents, keep the Shabbos, right? Keep the language one, honor. Yeah, those are positive. I'm looking for the negative ones to become a moral ceiling, an aspiration, something to reach toward. Let me ask you a different question. This is a very deep question, and we don't have all morning to discuss it, but it's so worth opening. So this is the beginning of a different section of the Torah. Next week we have Mishpatim and then Truma. This is the beginning of a section of the Torah that's given over to law, mitzvah, commandment. Now, I was trained as a conservative rabbi. I lead a conservative congregation. I observe a lifestyle that's identified as conservative Jewish, and I sometimes think that way. I rebel against it an awful lot because that's my personality. You were trained as a reform rabbi, led a beautiful reform congregation, have been a leader in that movement. The principal difference between the two, by the way, for those who are listening, it's not reformed. That's a church. It's reform. It's an ongoing process. The principal difference has to do exactly with this question. The conservative movement maintained a sense of halacha. There are mitzvot, they are commandments, they are imperatives. They're given to us like law. It's not a question of whether you want to do it, you got to do it. It's an objective tradition out there. Someone comes to me and says, I want to do something. And I say, I'm sorry, that is not kosher. That is not allowed. And they say, what do you mean? I want to do it. It's an expression of my religion. I said, so I have no objection, no expression of your religion, but I'm not going to sanction it because it's not part of my tradition. You were raised in a Reformed tradition, or you taught a Reformed tradition.
Late training, but yeah.
Yeah, but the Reformed tradition is based on the notion of moral autonomy, that the higher moral values are the ones we choose for ourselves. And because of that, the Reform movement did away with the whole language of mitzvah. They've tried subsequently to bring it back, but basically did away with it. It's my own religious search, and I have to make my own religious conclusions, and no one can tell me that this is kosher or treif, this is acceptable or unacceptable, this is mutar or asur, right? So the question is, as a conservative, I ask you, is there room, can you have a religious community without a sense of imperative? Can we have a coherent community where everyone makes their own decisions? Is autonomy really possible? And on the other side, the question I suppose that you would want to ask me is, in a modern society where we teach our children, and I hear this every Shabbos when parents tell their bar mitzvah kids, now you're an adult, stand up on your own 2 feet and think for yourself and make your own decisions, which means moral autonomy is the language of our culture. Is there any room for mitzvah, for commandments that are objective, outside of ourselves, and unbreakable?
Yes. Well, the answer is yes and no. And here's how the yes and here's
I'm so glad you said that.
Yes. The yes and the no is not the yes. Let's start with the yes. You cannot have a civilization, any kind of civilization, Jewish, American, European, it doesn't matter. Any group of people, you cannot have it unless you have a belief in moral absolutes. Moral absolutes means that what we do, how we behave, must have a standard that is absolutely true for all people facing that situation. That's what Immanuel Kant determined in his categorical imperative in his critique of practical reasoning, that act only on that maxim which you would will to be a universal law of nature. So the term that's relevant here, without getting into philosophical weeds, is universalizability. It means if you can't universalize what you're doing, meaning if you can't say what I'm doing here in this situation, every rational person should do.
Right. It's what your mother used to say. What if everybody behaved that way?
Exactly.
Right? And the answer is, if you're not willing to live in the world where everybody behaves that way, what you're doing is wrong, right?
Exactly right. So now you need that. Now the question is, can something be moral if it's heteronymous, meaning if someone says, you do this just because I say so, because the tradition of Judaism says so, or the king says so, or the Tsar, or Hitler, or anybody says so. You say, no, you can't have, to answer your question directly, you cannot have a sense of mitzvot in the world that Reform Judaism inhabits now and conservative Judaism has been pulled into. Because one of the heroic elements of early conservative Judaism was it said, look, we'd like to count women in a minyan, but you can't. It's not our tradition to do that, so you can't do it. And I know people who were ordained as conservative rabbis who left because of that and became Orthodox of a form, like our friend David Novak and others. And so you've changed, and you say, well, all right, so we are counting women. And then you say, well, we can't separate men and women in prayer. We said that. And we don't care if it's a mitzvah because it isn't something you can universalize, and it isn't a tradition that we honor because it discriminates against women. You said, no, it's halacha, and then you gave in. We said women cannot be ordained as rabbis. In 1972, 50 years ago this year, when I was ordained with Sally Priesand, the first woman rabbi. And eventually, you said in your tradition, okay, we're ordaining women rabbis now too. So from my point of view, we're in the same boat. There used to be meaningful distinctions between conservative and reform synagogues and ideologies. That's over. That is over. There is no meaningful distinction. Yes, it's true in conservative synagogues, more people keep kosher, more men wear kippot. But in general, the big issues, equality for women, openness to LGBTQ people, and now even intermarriage, we're in the same boat. We are in the same boat. There are only two, and as far as orthodoxy is concerned, they say, yeah, go struggle with that. We have the real thing. I said, no, you don't. No, you don't. I can point to 10, 15 issues of halacha that were changed because they didn't fit the times, starting with Hillel's prose bull, the very first example of Reform Judaism, where you couldn't collect interest over the Shemitah year and the Yovel, the years of release of debt, and the people came to Hillel and they said, we can't take out loans in the seventh, in the fourth and fifth or sixth years. They won't give us any rate we can pay. So he said, okay, I'm going to create something called a prose bull, which basically was a loophole around the clear mitzvah that you can't charge, you have to cancel debts and free slaves. So I don't even believe orthodoxy is in the place they think they are. The only difference between the movements is people who take Judaism seriously and people who don't. And I can tell it immediately, and so can you. When you're talking to somebody they read some psychological self-help book and they think that's Judaism, and they come in completely unaware of our traditions. They haven't struggled against any of the mitzvot because they don't know what they are. And that's really embarrassing and difficult. But what I find is that most of the great rabbis, and I think I learned this really in Hillel, Eddie, because I was never a denominational rabbi for so many years. Right. Yeah. I was the campus rabbi for everybody at Northwestern. So I'd say as soon as I meet someone who takes Judaism seriously, they're my friend. And as soon as I find someone who is ignorant of Judaism but thinks that anything they believe is Jewish, I'm just not interested in going any further with them. That's the way it is.
I appreciate that. So what you've done very nicely is I really appreciate that. So you've added a category. So I offered two choices. Either you're a halachic Jew and accept a system of commandments as obligatory and imperative and uncompromisable to an extent. Conservative Jews make compromises. Orthodox Jews make compromises, but different kinds of systems of compromise, organized systems of compromise, not personal compromises. And Reform Jews who have thrown the whole system out, do whatever they want, whatever the spirit strikes them. So Quaker prayer, where you sit and wait for God to strike you. Reform, and you've said, no, that dichotomy, that division is too stark and it's false. There's a category which unites both sides, which is serious and not serious.
Right.
And a serious Jew understands they're on a spiritual quest themselves, and it is autonomous because that's what contemporary culture has taught us. But it takes into consideration, it studies carefully, it engages in dialogue with the tradition and responds to it. Right. Yeah. And then the difference is the different kinds of responses we arrive at.
That's fine.
Might be different. You and I would say it is imperative that women be counted in a minyan, be made equals in the ritual life of the synagogue, be given leadership positions when they want. My Orthodox cousins, who are equally serious Jews to us, say, no, I'm not going to compromise that one. We have a different culture. And we can argue it. You see, that's the point, is we can argue it, but not on the basis of, well, God said it. The argument, I mean, he can say God said it, and I can say God said that we're all created in the image of God. We can have that argument. It's a beautifully Talmudic system, Mark, that you've created.
And as long as you're open to it, look, I daven on Shabbos in the Chabad Center in Aspen, and I'm sitting next to a mechitza, and it's an Orthodox service, and it's not my preference, but it's their preference, it's their way. And I'm happy to see, when I go there to daven, I always say a personal prayer. Dear God, help me to learn something from their ways. Help me to learn something from their ways.
Yeah.
And that's the way it is. Once you take this third option, that it's not Orthodox and non-Orthodox or conservative reform, Reconstructionism, New Age, that it's serious Jews and not serious Jews. And everyone knows the difference. Everyone knows when you're hearing someone who's faking it, they're not, and that's what Midrash,
I wouldn't be so, see, there I'm going to disagree. It's not so pejorative. Okay, I have a couple that's getting married, right? Very nice young people. And they are serious Jews. I mean, I know them a long time. That's why they came to me and asked me to officiate the wedding. And then she says, I've always wanted a wedding at sunset. And I say, I accept that. Do it on a Sunday. We have beautiful sunsets here in LA on Sunday nights. And she said, no, we've booked the venue for Saturday. I want the wedding on a Saturday at sunset. And I said to her, I can't do that.
Okay, that's
and she's very angry at me because, see, in her mind, religion is what moves her.
Okay, that's not acceptable.
And what I'm saying is there is an objective standard to this. It's called sunset plus 38 minutes. And I'm even willing to compromise a little bit on that, 35 minutes, but Shabbos means that much to me. And so you end up with and she doesn't, the thing that she doesn't understand, it's a lovely human being and a good Jew, is that for me, this is an objective standard that I hold myself to and I demand of others, that I practice in my own life and in my family. And to her, you can bend and twist because her flexibility is on that matter, by the way, is greater than my own. Now, there are other matters in which, first of all, my Orthodox cousins are much more rigid than I am on certain things, even on things that she's more, if you were to ask her about homelessness, about issues of tzedek, of social justice, she's much more, as it were, frum than me, this bride. It's but how we have these conversations without the pejoratives. You gotta be careful of the pejoratives.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm sorry, I wasn't referring to people who disagree with me.
Yeah.
I was at all. That's fine. What I was presenting to you is, people who don't take Judaism seriously, is primarily rabbis who are not trained to teach people how to do this struggle.
Okay.
For me, that's why Midrash attracted me, because Midrash was the realm where rabbis who, in the case of halacha, there was a psak din, there was a conclusion. This was the halacha was with Hillel or Shammai. It was clear the law had a conclusion, a right and a wrong. Midrash was ein meshiv ino adaruch. We don't debate about Midrash, we discuss it. And so for me, Midrash was the literary element of the struggle that I so prize in Judaism. Right. And by the way, apropos of my friend Tom Hartman, may his memory be blessed, it also includes learning from non-Jewish religions. It also includes learning from Buddhism. It say, what can I learn from them? Not just what can I learn from, if you're Orthodox, what could you learn from conservative or reform? It means being open to the entire wisdom tradition of the world. And that's what I think.
My Rebbe in the Rambam is, Maimonides. So here's a guy who spent 10 years of his life writing a code of Jewish law. which is, a code of Jewish law. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a recommendation. It was a law. And yet when you read his Agada, his Midrash was the Moreh, was the guide for the perplexed. And he makes a beautiful statement in there. He says, there are people who say that if you ask the reason for a law, you are violating the religious sensibility of the law, because we do the law because God said so, not because there's a reason behind it. Okay.
Right.
And then Maimonides says, that's dumb. That's foolish. He said, that would imagine that God, or we have to think about God as the most dictatorial, mindless king who ever lived, who just throws down ridiculous commandments for us to do. He said, any government, any king at least has reasons for laws. And we can always ask the reason of a law. And we may not find it sometimes, by the way. He said, there may be some laws we don't find. And if we don't find them objectionable, we should do them anyway, because it doesn't mean that tomorrow we might discover the reason, or in doing it, we might discover the reason. But to ask the question of, does this law have a reason? And if the law has a reason, is the law the best way? Then that makes the law instrumental. That's the point. It makes the keeping of the law instrumental.
Yeah,
right?
But you want it, but
it's the what for. What am I doing it for? What kind of a human being and a Jew does Shabbos make me? What kind of a human being and a Jew does kashrus make me? What kind of a Jew and a human being does tzedakah make me? And then the question is, well, is separating milk from meat the best way? Are there other things you should add to your kashrus, right? Should we be very careful about how the animal was raised as well as how the animal was slaughtered? Should we be more strict in our Shabbos observance because we live in a world where so much media is floating in all the time? And it becomes a very different way of doing halacha.
Yes, absolutely right. But what Maimonides does there is revolutionary, and it wasn't until Spinoza that its full implications could be brought out because the world wasn't ready for it. And that is, what Maimonides is really saying is, something isn't right or wrong because God commands it at all. It's right or wrong because it's right or wrong. And the standards for right and wrong for Maimonides were Aristotelian. They were Neoplatonized Aristotelian. It was, can you give an argument that was universal about doing this or that? And so back, I just want to say about your decision not to do a wedding before Shabbos ends, which is a decision I have made in the opposite way. I will do a wedding before Shabbos ends because in struggling with that issue, I say, as long as you take Shabbos seriously and don't do certain things on Shabbos that you do on other days of the week, visit a museum, walk on a beach, something Shabbostic, as long as you're doing that, when that's over, Shabbos is over. And from my point of view, being able to do an earlier wedding, which the reasons are embarrassing, but they're real for brides and grooms. If you start a wedding, in the summer, and you start the hors d'oeuvres at 9 o'clock, and that's to 10 o'clock, and then you sit down and you're having your chicken and peas at midnight.
I've been to that wedding, by the way.
Yeah, well, that's just not feasible for.
That's why Prilosec was invented, for those kind of weddings.
And if you keep kosher in the way that kashrut requires, there's a lot of people you're never going to have dinner with. And there's a lot of people that you're never going to be able to meet at a restaurant because the restaurant isn't kosher. And you have to then balance, well, what I can influence with these people, what I can learn from these people versus pulling in, circling the wagons. I am not a circling the wagons guy, but here's the deal. I recognize, as you do and as Maimonides did, that the standards for truth are not Jewish. They are universal. And the defense of lighting candles, listening to a ram's horn, not doing a wedding before the end of Shabbat, these are our traditions. Kaplan was right in this one thing. He called them the folk customs of the Jewish people. And the reasons for those are different. There are good reasons for some of them, but they aren't moral reasons. There's no moral reason that everyone should light candles on Friday night, Jews, Christians, Muslims. It's just for us. But don't steal, don't murder. Those are universal.
I'm going to disagree just on one point. And I see Betty's behind you, so we have to conclude. The moral reasons are universal, but you can't teach moral reasons in a universal language. There's no such thing as a universal language. You teach moral reasons in a language that is particular. You teach it through stories. You teach it through symbolic actions. You teach it through moral examples, through role models. And those are all particular. So lighting candles on Shabbos, lighting candles on Friday night is a completely Jewish thing. You're exactly right. There's nothing universal. Tommy Hartman, Oliver Shalom did not light candles on Friday night. But lighting candles on Friday night expresses the value of my family, the fact that I set aside a boundary time to spend with my family,
Yes.
the fact that I take boundary time to cultivate my soul, all things that your Catholic teacher, Tommy Hartman, and any sensitive human being would say, that's a universal value. It's a universal value, but it's taught through the particular form, the symbolic form and the symbolic language of my tradition. There's no way to teach there's no way to teach values universally. We only teach them through our own.
And conversely, I'm sure you would agree, the mitzvah of not having garments, of shatnez, the mixing wool and linen in a garment, there's nothing going on in there.
But unless you sit down and ask you, first I want to find out what the anthropology of that is, and I think I know, but that's another lecture. The question there is, does it have any moral teaching implicit in it? And then I have to think about that a little bit, because I've discovered that look, I'll give you just a quick example. We have to go, I know, but a quick example. So when we first got a computer, and we first hooked it up to the internet, it was sitting we have a study carrel in the middle of the house in the den. And my 13-year-old son, who today is a computer technician, is sitting at the thing, and he's looking at something that you would hope the 13-year-old son of a conservative rabbi or any rabbi would not be looking on the computer, but fully understand why he is. And as soon as I walk into the room, he tries to hide it. Like when we were kids, we tried to hide the Playboy magazine under the bed and mom wouldn't find it. He's trying to click it up. But the damn thing is these pop-ups and he can't click them off fast enough. So I sit down with him and I say to him, what are you doing? He says, I said, don't get mad. I understand. You're a healthy young man. I said, let's talk about this. There are and we got to the point, I said, look, you know, from having kept kosher your whole life, that there are things we desire, but we refrain from taking them because it's not us. It's not us at our best, right? You're a perfectly healthy young man, and looking at Miss February there is exciting and wonderful, right? But we're better than that. So you can take a moral form, a symbolic form, which doesn't look moral on the outside, and it gave me a language to talk to my son about something which is profoundly moral. So that young woman has a soul. Can you see her soul? He said, yes. I'm not looking for a soul. I said, yes, that's the problem.
Those are ethical arguments. Those aren't Jewish arguments.
Those are Jewish arguments. That's the point of doing it.
They're ethical to say you don't want to exploit women. Those are universal arguments against pornography.
It's been a wonderful argument. And you got to go because your wife is. I want to wish you a very good Shabbos, Marc. Thank you. And take good care and have a good Shabbos. And everyone watching, please join us following this Torah study for service at VBS. Wednesday evening, 7:00, we continue our discussion of Israel's culture. No Israel, pro-Israel, no Israel, with Tchelet Semel, the cultural attaché of our council here, talking about arts and entertainment in Israel as a window into Israeli identity. 7:00, it'll be on Zoom, YouTube, and Facebook. And I wish you a very, very good Shabbos. Take good care.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.